I think we're streaming, Josh, but it won't be official for another 5 seconds or so. Okay, now I feel confident we are.
All right, then we should say hello.
How you doing?
I'm okay. How you doing?
I'm doing okay, but I'd be doing better if I could get this technology under control, because at the moment there's like an infinite regress of like echoes.
Oh, that's fun. Is it easier if I
I'm going to have to ask people to bear with us.
So there's a term in Buddhism that Bob's well familiar with called dukkha, translated as suffering, discontent, unsatisfactoriness. And I found that there's a unique form of techno dukkha in the age of the pandemic, where whatever you have to do online inevitably goes pear-shaped. Only 2 minutes or 3 minutes or moments before you're meant to be live or recording. How does it seem on your end?
I won't try to describe the audio sensory experience I've been having, but it's consisted of hearing like 3 to 4 different voices. So sorry to everybody who's out there, if anybody still is. And I think I've succeeded in solving all the tech problems that have made me look bewildered for the last 2 minutes. How are you, Josh Summers?
Well, I said I was okay, but one of the things I've realized since our last chat is, well, it's a bit like, when you learn something new, you start seeing it everywhere. Or you say you want something new, like you're interested in a new car, suddenly that car is every other car you see. I've had the exact opposite since our conversations. I'm starting to see a lack of cognitive empathy everywhere. I don't know if you've had.
You're seeing that you lack it, or that other people lack it?
Well, primarily other people, but when in my more honest moments,
other people are, in my experience, other people are always the problem. It's them. Let me say to people who may not have been with us, cognitive empathy, we just mean basically perspective taking, understanding people's point of view, as opposed to emotional empathy, which is like feeling their pain. We've been talking about this. This is our 3rd conversation: cognitive empathy, regular empathy, in a broader context of mindfulness, the Dharma, and so on. And we're going to have a 4th conversation. It probably won't be a live stream, but we'll talk at the end of this about how people know when that's going to be aware. And finally, you're Josh Summers, yoga teacher, sage, and podcaster.
Yep. Yeah. Definitely, yeah. The sage thing is still a work in progress.
I was going to say, you're supposed to modestly demur.
Well, I'm probably only a sage in your eyes, and everybody else thinks you're insane for even intimating that. But no, there's no sagedom here. There's a seeking of wisdom on my part, seeking of more clarity, and that's what I'm pursuing.
That's much more humble sounding. That was well done. So anyway, yeah. Well, I have a question about your propensity to do cognitive empathy that's directly tied to a recent current event, and a tragic one. I'm wondering how strange I am in my tendency to at least try to do cognitive empathy, which is different from successfully doing it. And I want to get into that distinction later. But so this horrible thing happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Cop shot a man in the back repeatedly for reasons that are not very clear when you watch the video. And I'm wondering do you have you been paying much attention to this story?
Not a ton. I'm aware of some of the headlines, but I wasn't aware there was a recent shooting in reaction to it.
Okay, then last night, I guess a self-declared vigilante or something, a 17-year-old apparently, is charged with having killed 2 protesters. in Kenosha. And what I was just wondering how you process things like this. My tendency is to, like, I saw it, and my first thought is like, what is this guy doing? Two questions: why did he start shooting him? Secondly, why didn't he stop sooner? Um, and then I actually pursue that and start coming up with theories and like try to, I guess, charitably assume that the cop isn't just out to kill black people, and ask, like, how could something like this have happened? And I come up with actual hypotheses, although in this case, I can't say I found one that seems compelling. Do you do this?
I don't do that as much. It was what you just did. My first reaction is, oh my God, how can we have another one of these so soon after the last? And just, oh my God.
Yeah.
How is this possible? And then there is sort of, I mean, it's hard to gain, one of the themes around this that I've been finding tricky is how to bring these issues into focus in a way that it's not refracted through one lens or another. I mean, it's very hard to walk through the array of takes on something like that and make sense of it. I mean, I have my emotional concerns around this kind of violence and the tendency around it. But you can see kind of rational arguments. I mean, I don't know the details of this particular killing, but was there any attempt to resist, or
we didn't see one on the video. The cop is following him around a car, and then the guy tries to get in the car, and then you learn that the guy's kids apparently were in the back seat. And at first I'm like, oh my God, why would you do it then? And then I started thinking, well, maybe he thought the guy was a danger to the kids. Anyway, I just go through these things. And I can't say I've had tremendous success this time, but I was wondering whether I'm unusual in that regard.
I mean, would you clarify, sort of categorize the intellectual exercises you walk through as a form of benefit of the doubt giving?
Yeah, well, I think I think cognitive empathy should start with that in principle. I mean, first of all, I'm an advocate of radical cognitive empathy, trying to apply it to everyone, no matter how bad they seem. For somebody of my ideology, the Republican National Convention is a great opportunity for that, because there's a lot of people I react adversely to, for example. And yeah, I think it inherently involves giving people, trying to suspend judgment. Yeah, I think cognitive empathy should involve trying to suspend judgment, and also, just as we've discussed, separating the exercise from the allocation of blame. In other words, you just have to say up front, if I come up with a satisfactory explanation for why they did what they did, and perhaps even one that makes more people understand how it could have happened, that's not the same as absolving them from responsibility. I don't want my analysis to be burdened by the fear that I will let someone off the hook for something they should be held accountable for.
Right. And that's where I feel like even attempting to engage in an exercise of cognitive empathy on the behalf of, say, this officer almost immediately puts you into a rationalizing position, and a not friendly supporter of those that are getting killed and injured regularly.
Well,
it sort of has this political blowback immediately.
I mean, that is the danger. I mean, that's why it's hard to do. It's certainly hard to go through this exercise publicly, because if you look at things from the point of view of the person who seems to be like the miscreant, the person who did the bad thing, you will immediately get accused of defending them or whatever. Did we discuss last time the way that this used to happen to me with terrorism? I think we did. Like, I would come up with explanations for why I think terrorists do things, and then people on the right would accuse me of coddling terrorists and so on. It's a threat.
Well, and the other piece of it is that you're actually treating the issue on the level of the individual, in terms of trying to understand intent or motive or what's going on. And I think the emotional reaction is more looking at, this is a blatant issue of systemic racism, systemic violence, that it's structural, and it's not necessarily, it's the individual is just a symptom of that system. And so
yeah.
Getting back to some of the things we talked about in the past, that can lead to a kind of
but
potential attribution error.
But even to assert that this is a manifestation of systemic racism is to assume that you actually do know a certain amount about what was going on inside the guy's head, right?
We presume that.
That, in other words, he wouldn't have done this if the guy had been white.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm just strange. I think part of it is that I was an actual newspaper reporter for a while, and you learn pretty quickly that things you think you know about a story, like the more people you talk to, the cloudier it gets. And I think you actually develop more of a tendency to suspend judgment, for better or worse. And I can't say that this is a case where there are cases where there are obvious benefits to me of cognitive empathy. I can't say that in this case I can claim that I've generated tremendous benefits by trying to exercise it. But there's also the fact that you do never know for sure. You can try as hard as you want, and you never know for sure. We actually had I think one thing we want to do at some point is we have some audience feedback from last time. Some of it left in the comments on YouTube, which is a good place to leave the feedback because you and I will both see it. Some of it came to us via Twitter, and I want to talk about, and there are some examples of the perils of assuming you can know what's going on in people's heads. I want to talk about all that stuff. But is there anything you wanted to say out front about our overall project or where we're heading?
Well, we did title this particular conversation, "The Dharma of Bob," which assuming if you have a Dharma, you are approaching sagedom, which you tried to project onto me, but it's really, you have the sage vision, and the term Dharma, we derive it from Buddhism to some degree, but possibly with references in Hinduism. But it's the idea of a path of instruction the Buddha gave to help people understand or comprehend the way things arise, the way things are, to see things more objectively, and then relate or attune to those things in a way that mitigates unnecessary suffering. And that's really the key of how I see the spiritual path there. And I think the standard Buddhist world is a little bit can trend towards a little bit of kind of inert passivity, and not like a more engaged, a robust engagement with issues that are in the political sphere. And I think your worldview is a bridge into a connection from that the interest in reducing unnecessary suffering, and you're talking about it more on the international or domestic level. But I think that your worldview speaks to elements of what that engaged Dharma path might look like, without being, it's not religious. It's, these are concepts that people can reflect on and see if it's value for them and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, in my defense, you're the one who came up with the phrase, "the Dharma of Bob." That said, I have to admit that I never mind talking about Bob or his
Well,
Dharma.
that's the thing. I don't know what else to call it, and that's lingo for my world. But I don't know.
Maybe you should tell people what you think. Dharma is. I don't know how many people have a clear idea of what Dharma means, and there are different meanings. What do you mean by Dharma?
Well, I use it in the Buddhist context, which means the Dharma is sort of the way things are, or the way things arise or come together, the way things behave. And the idea within Buddhism is that you, by cultivating the capacity to see things more clearly, you engage with things with less tendency to cause harm to yourself or to others.
Right.
When your clear seeing is motivated by those kinds of intentions, and that's sort of the key thing. It's not just bare detached witnessing. It's witnessing that's infused with a kind of intention to how to move through through the world in a way.
Yeah, it's sometimes used to refer to the Buddha's teachings, but more generically, I think it means first the way things actually are, and then second, the way it makes sense to act in light of the way things are. So if you're following the Dharma, you're following the Buddha's understanding of the way things are, and also the prescription, the description and the prescription.
And then to put that together with the kind of the Hindu concept, or the more the Vedic concept, really is that Dharma is kind of your duty, which is sort of a descendant of a caste system, but it has been used more loosely to refer to kind of loosely your purpose, like your mission. Who are you in this world? Why are you here? What are you doing?
Even Steve Bannon uses it that way. Have you seen the Errol Morris documentary about Steve Bannon?
I have not seen that yet.
Worth seeing, but he's totally in. He's like, you've got your Dharma, and Bannon's got his idea of what his Dharma is. According to New York prosecutors, his Dharma included bilking naive supporters of the Wall project, but we can leave that aside.
I think now that he's locked, or he's in custody, I can actually watch the.
He's on bail.
He's on bail.
He came up with $5 million like that. $5 million bail.
Is his podcast back on yet?
Yeah, he's back on he only missed one day of his podcast. Yeah.
You're the only one that I know that listens to that.
It's fascinating.
That's how much cognitive empathy you try to cultivate.
I even try to understand what's going on in Steve Bannon's head.
Yeah.
I do.
I know. It's impressive.
Okay, so that's what Dharma means. And yes, you had come up with the
basically, let's tie it together. Let me just connect the thread. So it's, you see kind of a cognitive empathy deficit disorder causing unnecessary problems in discourse and in terms of relationships between different groups, etc. So I think that's part of your Dharma, is that you want to get people thinking about this as a way to kind of spread it into the cultural discussion more.
Yeah.
Or as a habit. Maybe it doesn't have to be addressed by name, but just, something like as we talked about earlier, the New York Times article from yesterday with Trip Gabriel about looking at the intent of Trump supporters and actually hearing from their side, why are they supporting?
What was I failed to read that piece. I saw the headline, and it's inexcusable that I didn't, but what was the upshot?
For a second, I actually thought you had written it, because it's basically your thesis, in that we tend to think, I think he was trying to say, I forget if he had layered this element into it, but it was that we tend to think of Trump supporters as this monolithic mob of irrationality, racism, and xenophobia. But if you actually talk to them, they have rational reasons for their support and their continued support. And it's not, it's because they feel, from their perspective, they see that he has delivered on the things that they care about, whether it's pro-life, the judges, relationship to China, toughening there, success of the economy pre-pandemic. They can point to all these things and say, pretty good. We're happy with this.
Now that doesn't prove that they don't actually have more kind of malign, even conscious reasons for supporting him, because if they had those, they probably wouldn't tell a reporter about them. But I do think, in my experience, and again, as I have confessed in the past, I have 3 siblings who voted for Trump. It's a more diverse group than you would think. Those 3 siblings have different reasons, and I haven't had the courage to ask them if they're going to vote from this time. But
a thought around that is that, because I'm guilty of that projection on Trump supporters.
Like they're all racist or they're all xenophobes
Right.
or
Yeah.
whatever.
And and when I see someone say, if anyone's in my Facebook or my Twitter following, you're a supporter of Trump,
Yeah.
like leave me now because I have no interest. Like I can understand all those feelings. But when I read the article or something like that, one of the things that occurred to me is that it's difficult to realize that you're not dealing with this monolith of racism. It's much more complicated. And I think to your point is that because when you realize the complexity of the issues around why they might be supporting them, that necessitates a very different kind of conversation if you intend to speak to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that the emotional response to that side is at cross purposes to what
Mm-hmm.
someone on the left might really want in some ways.
Yeah, I think the classic example of how understanding Trump supporters better could actually help Trump opponents is that I think a number of them have bought the Trump line that coastal elites and liberals generally maybe view them with contempt. And if that belief helps sustain their support for Trump, then you don't want to nourish that belief, right? I mean, you don't want to express contempt for them.
Mhm.
And yet a lot of contempt for them gets expressed on social media. So that's a good example of how
Well,
I think.
you recently retweeted a clip of that, I don't know, contempt or harassment, right?
Well, this was this was a little different in terms of who was involved. So this was um, protesters in DC who I guess the protests had been re-energized by the Kenosha shooting, but they were approaching people dining outdoors in Washington, D.C., and basically demanding that they raise their fists to affirm their belief in something. I don't know, their belief that Black Lives Matter or that racism is bad. It doesn't matter what the belief was. There were. I personally find this kind of thing really creepy. Like if you look at the history of how fascism gains power and creepy movements like this gain power, there's usually something like this where people are publicly intimidated. People who don't buy into the thing are shamed or something. And also, I just have a strong aversion myself to being coerced. And the and so anyway, there was this one diner in the video who was refusing to do it, and she was trying to explain to them why she was refusing. And I don't know whether it was because she didn't believe whatever they wanted her to profess, or she was just saying, look, you don't have the right to try to shame me in public. But I just tweeted that saying, this is, among other things, a gift to Trump, which I think it is. I mean, I think the video, if he can say these woke Biden supporters, who may or may not be Biden supporters, but he'll say it, are going around intimidating people into signing on to some mandatory code of belief, that's good for him. This is what he wants. I think the disorder, that's a tougher call, but I think some of the when the disorder gets out of hand, he certainly thinks it's good for him. I mean, the Trump side believes that stuff is good for them because they're the ones publicizing it. If you ask yourself, where are you seeing videos of looting in Kenosha? It's being spread mainly by Trump supporters. So they're the ones who think it's good for them, I guess. And they may be right. But yeah, I was just, it seems obvious to me that if he can point to people trying to intimidate others into professing their what he would call liberal beliefs or leftist beliefs or whatever, he wouldn't make a distinction. That's good for him. I don't know if that does it seem obvious to you that that's right, or did it
Yeah,
surprise
that
you?
makes total sense. That would play into his playbook in a way.
Yeah. So, um, So anyway,
do you have a sense how, I mean, this is again where my finger is not as much on the pulse as yours, but how much of that kind of activity is going on? This is where one of the things I need to confess is that my news sources, like the Times and the Post and things, are, left leaning, and, even on television news, like I don't tend to see that kind of thing. And the more I'm looking into things online, I'm actually kind of waking up, not in a woke way, but waking up to another presentation of, or another side of events that, I don't feel like it comes across my screen that much in terms of that kind of harassment.
I don't think there's that much of it. The problem with the world we live in is that the most extreme behavior on both sides gets circulated on social media and is taken by the other side as typical. This is just one of the biggest problems we face, is that Trump supporters, probably a lot of them, are looking at that and going, yeah, this is what the other side is like. Actually, this is like what 1/1000% of the other side is like, but it's what circulates on social media. And it's the same way with the Trump supporters. It's like this guy, the guy who killed the two protesters in Kenosha was a Trump supporter. There's a picture of him in the front row at a Trump rally, but almost no Trump supporters do that kind of stuff. Now a non-trivial number are closer to that than I might like. In other words, they, like he was one of a number of people with weapons who were kind of acting almost as vigilantes, but still, it's a small minority of Trump voters who would ever find themselves walking around with a gun at a protest. And, this is the curse of social media. And I wish there were more discussion of,
yeah, because I guess my intuition is that it feels to me like there's not just a small number, that there's this sort of
course
brewing.
It feels like that. That's
right.
What social media does. It makes you think that highly atypical behavior is everywhere. I mean, it's like during the initial round of protests after George Floyd, people in our ecosystem saw endless examples of cops being too heavy-handed. And people in the right-wing ecosystem saw endless examples of protesters smashing windows. But in fact, only a small percentage of cops were too heavy-handed, and only a small percentage of protesters smashed windows. And
is it lonely?
Am I lonely?
Is it lonely holding the middle there? The ability
it's so obvious. How can it? I mean, once I say it like that, doesn't it seem obvious?
Yeah, it's rational, but we're having a conversation, and I'm not being surrounded by all that other pageantry and imagery. Because I think this is what I was trying to come back to with the article I read, and it's the effect I felt that it had on me was that it forced me to experience a kind of cognitive dissonance around the fact that I was waking up to how skewed my perception was, and there was inconvenient perspective coming in that it was hard to sit with, and I was like, wow. And I think that's part of this skewing in the internal experience towards one emotional position, is that within the emotional position there's a righteous sort of establishment that reduces complexity to a very simple narrative. And I don't think that's particularly profound to say, but I do think an inability to tolerate cognitive dissonance within a multiplicity of potential perspectives is what makes it challenging to occupy the position that you're in.
Yeah, maybe
you seem to hold well.
Maybe you should say a little about cognitive dissonance. It was this thesis by the psychologist named Leon Festinger, I think. And the idea was that if there's some kind of incongruity between, say, one of our professed beliefs and the way we act, or between two of our professed beliefs or something, we act to reduce the incongruity. I may have that wrong, but the idea was The idea was something like that. And what you're saying, in somewhat the same vein, is just we'd prefer a simple narrative where it's clear what's right. It's clear that our side is right and the other side is wrong.
Right.
Yeah, we would prefer that.
And I'm sure you might even be able to explain that through a Darwinian lens.
Conjecturally,
Maybe.
yeah. I mean, I always want to be careful when I'm trotting out evolutionary psychology type explanations.
Oh, is that something you do more when you're offline? I noticed you, because some of our phone calls, it's much easier.
I just feel when people are watching, I feel a need to put in the asterisk and the
right, be more
disclaimer.
circumspect. Sure.
I mean, there's some evolutionary psychology hypotheses that I think are very firmly grounded, very strong reason to believe they're true. Others are more conjectural. I don't think there's any doubt at this point that our brains are engineered by natural selection to believe things that may or may not be true, because that tendency in our distant past helped ancestors get genes into the next generation. And some of these have to do with group affiliation, I mean, for starters, just believing you're right and the other person's wrong, and just an interpersonal dispute. We're very good at convincing ourselves that we are in the right, they're in the wrong. But it also works at the group level when we associate with a group. And I think the more intense the sense of conflict between the two groups, the more bitterly kind of zero sum the dynamic seems, the stronger the tendency to do all this. And you see this play out on social media, which is another way of saying that the stronger the conflict, the less in the way of cognitive empathy and regular empathy, just plain old feel their pain empathy. I mean, when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, there was just virtually no, in America, as far as I can tell, almost nobody said, isn't it kind of like unfortunate that we just, killed all, of course, Truman did things like he acted as if it was a military target. They described it in a way that made it seem it was a military target and so on. But once you think you're in a struggle to the death, and for that matter, just locking up Japanese Americans, you do all this stuff. Almost nobody lost any sleep at all over it.
So it's not that so much that there's a lack of empathy. It's just that the empathy is no longer intertribal. It's intra-tribal.
Yeah, and correspondingly, that tends to get strengthened. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Intra-tribal empathy gets strengthened. I mean, it's just, this is the frustrating thing. We are at a point where all this stuff is pretty clear. And I mean, and I might add, I think a certain amount of it was clear to Buddhist sages, possibly including the Buddha, millennia ago. But certainly modern science has corroborated a lot of this. Just the way, how unreliable our perception of the world is in situations like this. So there's almost
and actually, I think there was a commentator that said something, made a connection between, meditation and its relationship between different structures of the brain, where mindfulness, for example, might or does strengthen the prefrontal cortex, which will strengthen the ability to override or dampen, say, an emotional amygdala response that could drive towards one of the more reactionary positions.
Yeah, I mean, and I should say, I think mindfulness meditation, in my experience, doing it intensively and earnestly, can just help a lot. Can reduce the barriers to cognitive empathy, and even to empathy, and it might even weaken a bit intra-tribal empathy, which might not be a bad thing, if that makes sense. I mean,
it makes sense to me. Do you have a sense of the mechanism? Do you want to speak about what you think the mechanism in mindfulness practices that we would facilitate that?
I just think one of the main early insights of Buddhism is the extent to which our emotions, in subtle ways as well as obvious ways, shape our thinking. And, mindfulness, one of the things it centrally involves is observing your emotions and your feelings and your thoughts in ways that make your thoughts less obedient to your feelings, I would say. And it somewhat releases you from the grip of your feelings. And to the extent that you do that, in theory, some of these cognitive biases should lessen, because the premise is that they're emotionally driven. Just being calm is conducive to actual clear apprehension of the world, I think. And to put it more prosaically, mindfulness meditation can calm you down, can give you more equanimity. And I speak as a highly non-calm person.
Right.
It's not like,
Well, and if there are any repeat listeners, returning listeners from last week, they'll know that I am not always a paragon of calm.
Right. We have documented.
Yep. That's down in the record.
You're screaming at a neighbor.
Yep.
Although arguably not without provocation. I want to say something quickly, just so I'll quit thinking about it. In the early part of this recording, when I don't know what it looked like, I don't know what I looked like at that point. What was going on was I was hearing everything you said or I said 3 times in succession. It was
on its way to infinite regress.
It was when did I mention infinite regret? It wasn't quite infinite, but it was close enough to be disorienting. And the trouble with these YouTube live streams is that however you start out, that's it for posterity on YouTube. It's going to stay that way.
Yeah.
Well,
you just described a certain level of health in my view, just to hear my voice sort of repeating recursively again and again and again.
The part my voice was more unpleasant than hearing your voice, but it was all pretty disorienting. So okay, so I've explained what was going on now, and we can return to our subject now.
Can I read this though? I had scribbled one quotation from a Dharma book that I wanted to share that ties a few things together here, and I think you'll appreciate it. This is from a German monk who is, I think, a scholar in residence at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, which is the meditation center down the street from the place where you and I met in Barry, Mass. And this is in his book it's sort of his commentary on the Buddha's main sutta or discourse on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the way to establish mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about one of the qualities of mindfulness being a detached receptivity, but it relates to the cognitive dissonance, and this is why I'm sharing it. He says this detached but receptive stance of mindfulness constitutes a middle path, since it avoids the extremes between suppression and reaction. The receptivity of mindfulness, in the absence of both suppression and reaction, allows personal shortcomings and unjustified reactions to unfold before the watchful stance of the meditator, without being suppressed by the affective investment inherent in one's self-image. Furthermore, he says, maintaining the presence of mindfulness in this way is closely related to the ability to tolerate a high degree of cognitive dissonance. Since the witnessing of one's own shortcomings ordinarily leads to unconscious attempts at reducing the resulting feeling of discomfort by avoiding or even altering the perceived information.
Right.
Like that just seems like it sort of summarizes a lot of what.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm kind of happy to hear him use the word detached. Some Buddhists don't like that word; they'd rather say non-attached. But I think it captures that, in some sense, you can gain a more objective perspective on the world, but also on what's going on inside your head.
It connects it to the feeling of that dissonance that drives to a selection of certain information and the filtering out of other things.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the severing of that link that I think is required for the link of feeling to everything, the attachment, the affective attachment to everything that is the beginning of clarity. I'm going to disappear for 1 second while I get my glass of water. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, I kind of wonder how, one thing that I had to do to quit hearing you and me 3 times was close the browser on which I can actually see what's going on YouTube. I would like to see if anyone's commenting on any of this, but I'm afraid.
Yeah, I have our Twitter feed open for some questions from the week. But do you want to look at YouTube?
No, I that would only lead to more technological disaster. I have things from the week too. So let me say there's, I promised to say a little bit about, well, let me go ahead and say that. And then let's turn to some things that viewers have shared with us from last time and react to them. I promised to say something about the Republican National Convention. Let me just say, if it triggers you, sit there and watch it and just try to observe the triggering. Just try to ask, like, where is the feeling of aversion in my body? And maybe close your eyes if it helps, and just see if that changes your orientation to the material a little. And the other thing I want to say quickly is that now this is
can you what, like, maybe step back to something more fundamental, because I come across a lot of people that can't even look at it. Like, they feel like there's no point in looking at it. What do you think is intrinsically valuable in someone, an anti-Trumper, watching this convention?
Well, again, I think it's valuable to understand what the other side is thinking. It's just like, it makes sense that if you're trying to defeat politically another, and by the way, I'm not assuming that everyone here is anti-Trump. Probably most people watching are. I am hoping he'll lose the election. But if you are on that side and hoping he'll lose the election, I assume you don't want to do things that will help him, like on social media. I assume you don't want to retweet things that will help him. Well, you'll get a surer sense for what will help him if you tune into Fox News, if you watch the Republican National Convention. You'll see which narratives they're trying to sustain, right? And then I recommend not helping them sustain those narratives. So it's that simple. But the other thing is, and I wouldn't argue that if you just find it completely repulsive, you need to subject yourself to the pain. But I do think it's good practice to try to just expose yourself to views you disagree with, and try to become better at the task of listening to them. And if they sound, even if they sound completely crazy to you, and
well, actually, okay, this may be a really kind of simplistic application of the exercise, but it occurred to me that essentially by subjecting oneself to listen to it, if you're not a Trump supporter, this will probably be arousing a lot of strong feelings, as you're describing. You ask people to tune into it, and someone might wonder, what is the intrinsic value of doing that? And the thought I just had is that, in a way, it prepares you to be able to tolerate that feeling if you were to meet a real person in your day-to-day that shared those ideas, so that you would have a different ability to be with that experience, having, as the consequence of having become more tolerant and familiar with it in the course of watching
and by the way, one virtue of that, like, if you should encounter someone, maybe encounter them on social media, exchanging tweets or something, or maybe in real life, if you encounter somebody from the other side and they become aware that you're on your side, but you are able to listen to their views or whatever, treat them like a human being, I think you have helped your cause. Because, I mean, I'm speaking from the kind of anti-Trump point of view, but again, a lot of the energy that Trump gets from his base derives from a certain idea about people like us on the anti-Trump side, that we hold them in contempt, that we're horrible people, and we have some stereotypes like that about them often. But I think if you defy that stereotype, you have, in some tiny measure, drained Trump of some political energy. If even one of his supporters is a little less sure that all liberals are evil. I mean, it's a little thing, but let's face it, little things are what are at our disposal.
Right. Yeah.
Most of us are not tremendously powerful people. And if you take seriously the idea of exerting what positive influence you can in the world, you have to settle for small victories.
I don't know why I was thinking of this, but the analogy of what happens at a wedding when the band strikes up, and people like me who would probably never get up and dance under normal circumstances because the dancing is so offensive, you feel disinhibited at weddings. And there's a sort of phenomenon that people that probably aren't all that great at dancing really get down and do it. And I think there's a way that with like the social media thing, like everybody else is doing, like, what is my little voice added to this? No one's gonna be noticing. It's just it's part of the chorus. And so there's like, whether I do it or not really isn't going to make much difference. I think that's probably part of the emotional calculus most people sit with.
Yeah, it feels like a tidal wave that you're, and resistance seems futile. And I suffer from that myself sometimes. But I also suffer from just plain old fear, like you ask if I feel lonely, having the perspective I do.
I mean, what occurs to me though is and it gets back to one of the tweets we had that was referencing Martin Luther King. Of course, I can't find it now, but just I think
I've got it. It's
love
from
everyone.
It's from somebody whose Twitter handle is MDLBRK. That's at MDLBRK. Whose name is EMV, so or initials or something. Anyway, it says, would love to hear you and Josh discuss the idea I've heard associated with MLK, something along the lines of treat no one as the enemy. Seeing so much, if you're for Trump, you're dead to me sentiment lately. I may have cut off the tweet, but you get the idea.
Yeah. And all I meant by mentioning that is just that there's lack of modeling leadership on this skill. There's no political benefit to it right now, it seems.
No, but it's interesting. Martin Luther King obviously was a Christian, and the Bible's admonition to treat your enemies charitably is arguably tactical advice. I'm talking about the specific thing that is said. It's said by Paul in the New Testament, and he is actually quoting the Old Testament. And it's something like, if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If thirsty, give him drink. And then it says, for by doing so, you will be pouring burning coals on his head. Nobody ever quotes that part.
Yeah.
but, and I don't think that there's complete agreement on the appropriate interpretation. But I think the idea is that sometimes you're actually helping your enemy with enmity. Whereas if you treat them better, in at least some circumstances, it can drain them of a kind of energy, which I'm arguing might be the case here in some cases. But anyway, you're saying you're saying that you're just not hearing that much.
Yeah, I'm not hearing much, but I'm wondering if you see it, or do you see any bright spots in this?
Not enough. And I don't, there are progressive Christians. I'm in touch with, I know some of them. I actually have an affiliation with Union Theological Seminary in New York, although I'm not really right now doing much there. I'm nominally affiliated. And I've taught a course there in the past. And I have to say, I haven't seen as much as I would like of people really taking seriously the idea of loving your enemy. I mean, and it's hard, but uh now there's somebody who's actually very good on this, but I can't think of her name, and she's as much a Buddhist as a Christian, but
At Union?
she's not at Union. I did a dialogue with her, and her name is not coming immediately to mind. She's African American, and maybe I'll try to have it next time we talk. I do, I've been doing several, 2 or 3 of these a week for the last 15 years. And not all of the names of everyone springs immediately to mind. Also, I'm older now than I was 15 years ago.
You're far better than most, Bob. You're far better than most.
But she just, I'd actually like to catch up with her now after George Floyd and Kenosha and everything. But I guess in general, I have not heard many people even try to do what I was alluding to earlier and just go through the mental exercise of looking at things from the cop's point of view. I haven't heard it. I mean, you see plenty of that on the Trump side, and then they don't do the thing of maybe so much of looking at things from the African Americans' point of view or the protesters' point of view. But I am not aware of many progressives, publicly at least, saying, can we look at things from the point of view of the cop?
I heard that a little bit in the clip that you shared from Michael Brooks last week, which is, part of the reason we got you starting on these conversations. Just the issue of rehumanizing people.
Yeah.
And remembering that.
Yeah, and there's, well, maybe that's enough, but just kind of understanding. I mean, last night I was watching, or maybe the night before, Donald Trump Jr.
Yep, 2 nights ago. It's
so easy to dislike him. But, I was thinking, and this isn't cognitive empathy per se, but I think it is an article of faith of mine that, I guess if I had been born into his shoes, I guess I'd be him, right? I mean, it's like easy for me to say, how could you possibly be this guy who goes over to Africa, like kills big game and poses proudly with it as if like they had a chance against you, and all the things he does. But then I thought, well, there must be something that made him the way he is. I mean, and presumably if I'd been born with his genes in his shoes, and let's face it, he had a bizarre upbringing. Donald Trump was his father. Donald Trump's father was a bizarre guy, right? Bizarre, super creepy, oppressive, bad guy. And Donald Trump grew up with that. Now, I can hear people saying, oh, are you excusing Donald Trump or whatever? I guess my view is that in a certain sense, everyone, I'll leave it there. The short answer is no, so far as what is in the way you mean the question, no. So maybe we should get on to a little more feedback from viewers.
Sure.
So this comes from NYC Trader. Actual Twitter handle is Hanuman Pi, Pye, Hanuman being the Hindu god, I gather.
The monkey god who
is that right?
Rescued Sita from Sri Lanka. Okay,
you're better versed than I am. What I know is that there's a song that I love called Baba Hanuman, Hindu chant.
It's a devotional kirtan chant.
Yeah.
Right. So what's the question?
Okay, so it's not a question. He observed, Jeffrey Miller, a guy who's been on my podcast, evolutionary psychology, kind of a psychologist, kind of an intellectual dark web type, I would say, conservative, very anti-social justice warrior, had tweeted this, to which Hanuman Pai responded. But Jeff had tweeted, family neighborhoods are full of sleep-deprived parents and easily woken babies. If you're marching through late at night making noise, so he's talking about protesters, presumably. if you're marching through late at night making noise, your goal isn't to win people over to your cause. Your goal is to hate, harass, torment, and demoralize your enemy. Now, the good news is that is, I guess, an exercise of cognitive empathy. He's at least coming up with a theory of what they're thinking. Not a very flattering one. As Hanuman Pai points out, what Hanuman Pai says is, I'm listening to the latest Robert Wright podcast on cognitive empathy, and this tweet proves his point. Reimagining the motivation of a group you don't like to fit your cognitive bias. And I would say, yeah, I would agree that there's a little of that going on, at least in Jeff's tweet. It's a group he doesn't like, and he's coming up with an unflattering theory of what's going on in their minds. And this gets back to the fact that trying to exercise cognitive empathy is just the beginning. It's very easy to be kind of led astray to project overly flattering or unflattering theories on people, depending on your relationship to them. And you'll never know for sure, by the way, if you're right. All you can do is try to clear away the biases and do the best job you can, and keep comparing your hypothesis to the evidence and revising it if necessary. Anyway, Jeff Miller replies to Hanuman Pai, cognitive empathy cuts both ways. The whole point of my tweet was to get protesters to cognitively empathize with parents and kids. Fair enough, I guess. That maybe that was part of his tweet. I don't think that means his particular exercise of cognitive empathy had itself been accurate, and then finally a third party chimes in on Jeff's side, I guess. Evidently, one cannot be cognitively empathetic, in quotes, to the people harassed by the privileged racists having their narcissistic, peace-disturbing marches. Seems to limit the utility of the concept. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's an illustration of how hard it is. I mean,
and how strong emotion can flare. I mean, I can see myself if I'm trying to get to sleep because I had a long day the next day, and like protesters or chanting and harassment around the street.
It's also a case of kind of essentializing the group. In truth, there were probably different people in the group who had different conceptions of what they were up to. Some of them were probably happy to disturb and annoy people. Some of them had a different rationale. Who knows?
But I think it does cut both. I mean, I did like his comment that it cuts both ways, that it's something that, and I think this is one of the obstacles to it, in that it until there's a sort of a signal from both sides that there's collaborative engagement in that exercise, it feels concessionary to begin it without signs that the other side will meet you.
Right. So quickly, I don't know how long, we're getting to the point where the actual Republican convention is really heating up, and I know all our viewers want to go watch it.
Well, now they're ready because they know how to. We can give them a reminder of that tip you had. Do you want to give any sense of how you're thinking at this point about what you want to do with continuing the conversation?
Yeah, I think we should discuss that. I first want to give a shout out to Thomas Muir and PERK is the commenter's ID. These are both from YouTube, and they both spoke to the point I was just describing about the challenge of exercising cognitive empathy. I guess Thomas Muir says, this is a fragment. Won't all this give us a ready model of irrationality, which we can then attribute to people with whom we disagree? I mean, just, the danger of unflattering projections. Quickly, PERK mentioned something maybe we can take up at a later date, because he mentions Michael Brooks. He says, I think it raises a larger point about cognitive empathy that I believe Michael would have also supported, namely that we have to create the conditions, including the material and cultural conditions, that facilitate cognitive empathy. I think that's worth getting at too in the future, which leads to your question of what the future will look like. So you and I had talked about being up for another one of these conversations. And always, interested in talking about my worldview. And so I guess we agreed we should keep talking. I think we also, I think I amply demonstrated at the beginning of this that maybe live streaming is not the medium that God put me on this planet for. I'm not saying we won't do it again.
It's high pressured. It's high pressure.
But it seems like my technical prowess is actually degenerating. It gets worse every time. Like this was like a living hell. You have no idea what it was like to be in my head when I was hearing 3 versions of everything each of us said. Anyway, there may be virtues of live streaming, but I think, we talked about this, I guess last night. And so we're going to do another one of these. It won't be a YouTube live stream. Now, it will still appear as this one does on the Meaning of Life TV channel on YouTube, on the meaningoflife.tv website, and in the Wright Show podcast feed as an audio podcast. And I'm guessing we'll probably take at least a week off. So this will probably be like after Labor Day.
Yeah. I mean, the basic idea is we're coming towards the end of the summer, Labor Day, and we want to pause, reflect, get a sense of what we might think of doing as we pause and reflect. And the next signal would be we'll likely record one for your podcast. People who are interested can tune into that and basically get a sense of what our next step would be if there is a continuance.
Right. And so now they can also, so in terms of finding out when it's going to be, they can, again, they can follow my podcast feed, The Wright Show. They can also go to the meaningoflife.tv website and sign up for emails if they want, so they'll be notified when a new Wright Show shows up or when any Meaning of Life TV thing shows up, or they can look. Do you plan to send out an issue of your newsletter before?
Yeah, if we're doing anything, I'll announce that in my newsletter. People can sign up there. But if anyone doesn't know much about Meaning of Life TV, I don't know if you want to just give a brief sense of what they can expect, because there's a lot of great content there. Conversations
there is,
you've had, and other folks too.
Yeah, it actually fluctuates in frequency and in the kind of content it is, but if you dig into the archives, it's everything from a lot of philosophy, the mind-body problem, ethical philosophy, philosophical implications of quantum physics, plus a certain amount of mindfulness stuff, Buddhist stuff. I just taped one with Sharon Salzberg about her new book that'll air in a couple of weeks. And I've done one recently with Bhikkhu Bodhi on militarism and excessive militarism and how Buddhists might feel about that. So yeah, and again, there's both a YouTube channel, Meaning of Life TV channel, and the Meaning of Life.tv website. Same content by and large on the two, except that the live streams only show up on YouTube. But so the next thing we do will show up on all these. I may build them if it happens that an edition of my newsletter, the non-zero newsletter, nonzero.org is coming out, then it'll be built in that. But maybe your newsletter is more reliable. Also, you should remind people about your podcast, shouldn't you?
Yeah, my podcast has been in flux, or it's in transition, I should say. It's for the last couple of years focused on a particular kind of yoga called Yin Yoga, which I teach, which is quite meditative. You stay in poses for several minutes and can contemplate your experience. But in the fall, I'm transitioning it to a kind of a broader theme, looking at kind of the shadow, light, and unified experiences of the human condition. So looking at not just spiritual practices, which tend to emphasize the all light side of things, but also kind of some of the explorations around shadow work and how to integrate shadow in a Jungian sense, to have kind of a more integrated being.
And eventually I want to get into some of this stuff. You have generously offered to, if we keep having these for a long time, help me kind of sketch out my worldview broadly.
Yeah,
And
and it actually maybe put this along on this fire for a future chat is, I think for me, one of the really big questions is what is strategic, and like once you develop cognitive empathy, and it's another thing to strategically engage in a way that kind of nudges things in the direction that you care for it to go.
well,
So
this is
whether it's conversation, whether it's in online participation, et cetera.
yeah, let me say two things. First of all, I was going to say I'm interested in parts of your worldview that ultimately intersect with mine, like this dark shadow stuff. You're too old to remember the daily soap opera Dark Shadows. I mean, too young to remember the daily soap opera Dark Shadows, but
My
it was
gray
there.
beard would, yeah, I'm too young for that, I think.
You are too young for that. But there's that. But yes, I am interested in trying to operationalize this and figure, actually do more
Something
good.
I don't know a ton about, but I spoke to one meditation teacher on my podcast last year, Oren J. Sofer, who's part of the teacher scene that we're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But he kind of focuses on nonviolent communication, and that, I think that implicitly tries to, or even explicitly, but tries to work around some of the dynamics in conversation and dialogue that drive things apart. And one of the themes is learning to perceive shared needs, and I think that could be part of the strategy, is just how to.
You mean finding overlap between your needs and whoever you're dealing with?
Yeah. So, for example, like gun rights, there's people that are for greater gun legislation, greater gun control, and not. But the shared thing is they both care about safety, and they have a different perspective on what's involved in coming to safety.
Yeah. No, that's like finding the non-zero sum dimension of your relationship. Yeah.
Right. But so in terms of operationalizing your worldview, I think that's a problem, and that dials right into 1/8 of the Buddhist Eightfold Path of wise speech, because speech tends to be the one that kicks up all the conflict.
Yeah.
It may,
more so than silence, certainly. Yeah.
Right. Unless you're, I won't go there, but the reference of white silence is violence, and therefore you'll be.
Okay. So yeah, no, and I'm interested in people's input as to how you actually do something in the real world that's productive, and people.
Yeah, if we could solicit, I mean, if we do have more engaged conversations with audience members, getting their experiences in, where do they try, and
so they can leave. They can tweet at us using our Twitter handles. Yours is Middleway Josh. Mine is Robert Writer. They can also just leave comments on YouTube here, and because that's an easy place to read them. And we'll take a look and integrate those into our future conversations, because I am very much interested in hearing how this stuff sounds to people, what they think we can do with it. And as I was saying, I'm interested in your stuff too. Like, I genuinely want to learn more about like your Jungian like stuff.
Well, that's a work in progress, but I'm starting. It's more coming out of my own experience and practice, and I feel like it's a very overlooked aspect of existence that say the love and light sides of spirituality do not really adequately treat. And I think it's a setup. So yeah.
A dark. Well, I do not deny that I have a dark side. So maybe we'll discuss that in the future.
Yeah, we can talk about it. I mean, I think you said maybe privately, but that you felt like you're aware of the dark side for a while, and I think your Dharma is just like Donald Junior there, you know, his world, he's a product of his upbringing. Like there's elements of your upbringing that I think have probably shaped your worldview, whether it was how much you moved when you were growing up.
Totally.
So probably some other formative experiences. And I think that would be probably part of what we would want to discuss too.
Yeah. No, I think that had an effect. I think it may have disposed me toward cognitive empathy, but in the sense that you just keep having these new social landscapes you have to figure out.
Right.
Each one's different.
And it becomes an adaptive necessity, whereas for most people, it's not required
as much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. Sorry again about the tech troubles at the beginning.
All is forgiven. Thank anyone in the audience. Thanks for
if there's anybody still with us, God bless you.
Smash the like button.
Oh yeah, hit the smash the like button, as Michael would say.
Right.
On YouTube, whether you're watching us live or later. Yeah, the like button brings more people to and builds the audience, and eventually everyone in the world has cognitive empathy, and we save the planet.
Yeah,
that's the way this is going to work.
Yeah.
Okay.
We avert the. Let's put it in Buddhist terms, which is it's the path via negativa. So we're averting apocalypse. We'll let whatever else emerges emerge.
Right. All we want to do is,
it's like Buddhism focuses on eradicating unnecessary suffering. It doesn't talk about the peace and love and the connection and the joy and the equanimity that comes from that. But
right, our goals are modest. We just want to avert the apocalypse. It's not like we're trying to actively build a better world or anything. We just want to give the species a chance to a couple of centuries,
so that other people can build it and actively build a better world.
That's their job. That will be the job of future generations. Yes. Okay. So this was fun. Thanks, Josh. I hope people will